Thank you, everybody, for staying. I know that we're like cutting very close to lunch, so this is always like a tricky time.
We'll talk fast.
But yes, I'm like very glad that we have the chance to have Christine in Istanbul, and we can talk to her about 500 startups in general and what 500 is doing around the world, why, and basically specifically what we do in Turkey. So Christine, I mean, I hear this from you a lot, given that I think the entire 500 startup culture is based on this, but you have a very specific mission around the world, and you embody that within 500. Can you tell the audience today what that 500 mission is?
Yes. Well, I'm really excited to be here in Istanbul. It's really amazing to see so many passionate founders, and just floored by just how many people there are here. But to Rina's question, our mission statement is to discover and back the world's most talented entrepreneurs, help them create successful companies at scale, and build thriving global ecosystems. And it really is rooted in this belief that from the very beginning, talent exists all around the world. It's certainly in Silicon Valley, but that the next big companies will likely come both from Silicon Valley as well as outside of Silicon Valley, and in fact, all around the world. And back in 2010, that was a very contrarian view. A lot of people questioned the caliber as well as the quality of deal flow just anywhere outside of the Valley. And so for us, it was really that belief that, when you think of an entrepreneur, it should be, I think, like a blank canvas. It's not just a certain type of person from an Ivy League. Apologies to Rina, because I know that's her alma mater, but not the hoodie young male. It could be anybody. So that to me is like the vision of what 500 is out to do. That there are huge opportunities to back companies, and it could be from anywhere in the world, from any kind of person. And we've really proven that, I feel, over in 9 years. Great testament to that is the investments that we've done here in this market. But for me, certainly as someone who I don't necessarily identify with that profile either, it is quite empowering.
Yeah, I mean, can you briefly talk about some stats within 500, what we've done over the past 9 years that makes us so special?
Right. So our portfolio overall is now more than 2,200 companies, and now in 2019, the portfolio it's teetering on the edge of 50%. It potentially has been pushed over to 50% from outside of the US or international. So for us, that's huge. And even in the early days, it was probably still maybe 20–25%, which by standards at that time were large. So portfolio 2,200, more than 50 close to 50% from all around the world, across 75 countries around the world as well. So we invest where we have a local team and local funds, but we also invest in markets where we don't necessarily have that presence, but we hopefully, in our grand vision, intend to. Our team is about 120 from around the world as well, and in terms of kind of capital under management, we have now close to about 580 million across all of our funds.
That's fantastic. And not only half the portfolio, but I think half of almost the unicorns that we have in our portfolio are also outside of the US.
Exactly. So in our portfolio, I think unicorn has now become a very a global term. Everywhere in all corners of the world, they know this term of unicorn, which, funnily enough, it was coined in, I think, 2013, and it was coined with a very specific view of US only. But now, I think everyone here knows that term, billion-dollar companies, and now even unicorns aren't so big anymore. But for us, in our portfolio, we have 16 unicorns, and almost half of those are also outside of the US. So it's really trending what is happening in the world and globalization of both entrepreneurship and venture.
And I guess when we look back on how we started the thematic funds around the world, these regional funds, it started out as an experiment, I guess, back in the day. And I guess it's safe to say now that the experiment has proven, successful. Yeah. What was the thinking behind when you guys started launching these micro funds around the world focused on a specific region that was far from the US?
Yes, so what we now call today our thematic funds, but back in the day we called our micro funds, a lot of the vision behind that was really trying to double down on investing in markets all around the world, and we felt like one of the best ways to do that is to find people on the ground, very talented GPs, and give them kind of that ownership and independence to go out and say, I have a fund for this market for 500, and be able to write kind of those very early checks into these companies. It was interesting that in the beginning, I wish we could say we had crafted this whole master plan to have funds around the world, but really it was just from this belief of investing globally, and it evolved into now what we have today is these thematic funds, of which we have more than 10 around the world. And the vision was being able to be kind of almost like the scouts in these markets, because they know the markets better, and then at some point these funds would not just double down, but so would the global fund. It's definitely evolved both as the funds and the markets have evolved and just kind of things have changed around the world. But now these funds have become, I think, really a cornerstone to 500 being global, because we can, it's so much more powerful to say we have 500 Istanbul, 500 Durians, which is our Southeast Asia fund, and they're all investing as part of the overall 500 vision. Versus saying we have one fund and we have some allocation towards this market. That can certainly work too, but from our model, despite that, it is definitely there's a lot of how the sausage is made internally, as Rina will know. Ultimately, it's just been so powerful for us to have kind of these vehicles.
And I think when these thematic funds go to places around the world, when there aren't many to begin with, maybe there's some local activity, but a lot of the internationals aren't there yet. Access to capital isn't as easy. It is much easier, although it's like a harder path to set up. Once you do set it up, it's easier to create like a defensible brand. Versus let's go to Silicon Valley and the tech activity, the hub of the world in terms of tech and investing. So many funds, so many accelerators, so many different investors at all different stages, promising value add. How does 500 stay competitive in mature markets? In a lot of markets around the world, the fact that we have a local fund there, it makes a huge difference, just because there's such a gap between what founders need and early stage capital. You can often find larger funds, but at the early stages, of course, you're either bootstrapping or it's just so hard to get that initial friends and family or angel round. So I think in many ways that, at least for now, it's certainly changing. That's definitely been a competitive advantage for 500, that we're willing to take those early risks with a local fund that's investing at a stage where there is a need. But in addition, I think, and obviously Rina can speak to this as well, but for 500, we're known as a global firm, but we still have those Silicon Valley roots. So that's something that we do try to bridge in terms of both the education and the mentorship. And we've done this certainly by deploying capital into these markets, but also programs around the world, whether it's kind of informally or formally, bringing both kind of the Silicon Valley knowledge, but just actually everything we see globally, because that also is a gap in many markets around the world. In the Valley, you can walk into, I live not in San Francisco, but I live in kind of in the peninsula, which is what it's called, and you can walk into any coffee shop and you're bound to hear someone talking about their cap table or LPs and funds. So it's very common. That doesn't happen everywhere around the world. So for founders to be able to not just get access to those resources, but also just be around other founders or get that kind of help is we take for granted for sure in the Valley. So what 500 can do to help contribute to the ecosystem is something that's very important for us. So I mean, that's amazing, because I think Silicon Valley, I mean, having those roots there, that's something that has been very attractive to the companies that we've invested in here in Turkey. So I don't know if this is something you've seen around the world, but I think in Turkey we've seen like first generation of companies that were more or less Me Too businesses, XYZ of Turkey or XYZ of like the greater region. And they've done really successfully, like they've done amazing things for the ecosystem and for the founders and for the investors, amazing products and services. But now we're seeing basically using local talent to create something internationally defensible, to have a global audience and revenue stream and base. And for that, being able to provide an international platform with roots in Silicon Valley has been very, very useful to entrepreneurs here. Is that something you're seeing around the world with different thematic fund investments or direct investments that you guys do out of 500?
Definitely. So what we've seen is in different markets, and every market is so different, that you often have a difference in, there's entrepreneurs who are going after their local markets. Like you said, it could be a clone of existing global business or something that's just very unique to that market. And those could certainly be very strong investment opportunities. So we've invested in a lot of businesses that are targeting local markets, even if the local market is kind of, in comparison, small. But there are also a lot of entrepreneurs that have global aspirations. Now, whether the aspirations match what they're actually able to executing is sometimes a question. It's something we look for when we invest. But we see this many times around the world where maybe even in the earlier days, a lot of those companies were targeting the local markets because that's what they know. Some have been more successful in expanding, some haven't. And then they start out with global aspirations from day one. So it's interesting that as I think some of these markets mature, Southeast Asia is probably a good example of that. Some of the earlier business probably were targeting Southeast Asia. Now, as we've been there for many years, it's increasingly companies that have kind of a global outlook. So it's definitely, I think it will continue to be a mix, and I think there's definitely a need for businesses that are tailored towards the local market. And I certainly don't think that, despite the perception, there's a lot of value in even what is seemingly just a clone or copycat of an existing business.
And when we look at the market globally, we either see like investors or accelerators, and like they are in well-defined boxes, and they do one thing and one thing only. But we do something else. Like when we look at 500, we see 500 working with governments around the world or universities and offering training. Why is that?
Yeah. I mean, for 500, we feel like, in terms of our aspirations and our mission, it is really discovering and backing great talent around the world, and that the ecosystems that they play in have a huge impact on whether companies can live or die. And so for many venture firms, it's really just invest in the companies, they do well, we make money, return the fund, or hopefully more than return the fund. But for us, just given like our belief in our mission, a big part of what we do is certainly the investments and investing in great companies for financial gain. But we feel that it's so much broader than that in terms of what is going to change the world, change markets. So to Rina's point around us working closely with governments and corporates and all kinds of stakeholders, all of that is with that vision of there's so much that goes into building not just a great company, but building a very healthy ecosystem. And then when you think about the broader impact of startups, we see this time and time again in these, especially in the emerging markets, where these markets don't just see this as early stage venture for the sake of tech. It's really like to change the economy, creating jobs, because maybe there's other urgency that they want to see their cities or their countries to rise up to be a hub for entrepreneurship. They see that as the future. We see this certainly in MENA, and of course in what we do here in Turkey, in Latin America, that entrepreneurship is starting to be seen as like the kind of the hope for the next generation. And so for us, like there's so much that goes into making that possible. So that's why we focus on partnering where most Silicon Valley VCs probably would not care. Because we know that writing a check into a company, of course, is like one of the most important things, but it's also important to help bring that education to the rest of the market.
And I've seen, especially here in Turkey, just one success story creating its own little ecosystem, both in terms of creating new entrepreneurs, which were early employees in that said company, or other entrepreneurs getting the courage to say, hey, I can do that, or even like foreign capital or local capital looking to invest more into the ecosystem. Have you seen that in some of these remote countries that you've invested in? Just one successful company creating jobs and creating more startups. So does that tie into this ecosystem play?
I think definitely that helps in terms of if there is one success story or multiple success stories, then that's seen as like this beacon of hope of, see, like, you know, in the Middle East, of course, I think a lot of people mentioned Kareem as an example of Kareem, you know, had a huge exit. It is possible in the market.
Yeah.
And you certainly see that even still in Silicon Valley, like, you know, there's one example of this company that had a huge exit or IPO, then suddenly you see a lot of companies trying to do something similar in that, maybe in that vertical. But we see many examples, many examples of this both at the broader region as well as specific countries, where it's held up as like definitely as a case study, but also just as an example of, say, we can produce these types of unicorns as well. And I think that's very powerful. That hopefully it's one of many examples, but it's also, it helps inspire other founders who may be afraid to take that leap. And again, coming from the Valley, it's something that a lot of other investors aren't aware of, that in many of these markets, entrepreneurship is not in vogue the way it is, you know, where I am. It's much more, you know, culturally as well as just resource-wise. It's not for the faint of heart. But I think that the more that we get these types of examples, I think certainly the better.
And I guess like one of the final questions that I want to ask you is, we don't see women in tech a lot, period. Not in the investor side, not in the entrepreneur side, definitely not in decision-making positions. But there we are with 500, one of the most active Silicon Valley investors, also one of the most active around the world, has a female co-founder CEO, but also a lot of female representation in executive team and GP world around the world. Was that a conscious decision?
I think in some ways it was conscious, in some ways it wasn't, which is actually kind of unique. It wasn't architected such that we need to have this many women. And I think that it's interesting because I think when you think about diversity in your portfolio or in your team, a lot of people feel like it's enough to just have the mindset of, like, of course we care about it, but I think, you know, one thing to consider is, let's say you have a revenue target for your company, you wouldn't just leave it saying, oh, hopefully one day we'll have 10 million in revenue and just hope that it happens. You would definitely structure your sales team and just your pipeline to ensure that you hit that goal. A lot of people don't think about diversity in that sense. So even for us, as much as it's been in our ethos and we've been proactive about seeking the deal flow and recruiting diverse talent, certainly at the management level as well as just the broader, our partnership, it is something that even for us we want to make sure is a ritual, like it's part of our, that we don't just kind of let it happen. So it's odd that in many ways sometimes it's sort of happened, sometimes it's been a combination of being very deliberate about it. But I do think that it's often sometimes an afterthought for a lot of companies at the early stage, and I would definitely encourage anyone to try to prioritize it more from the beginning, because you know, when you think about how you hire your team, you know, certainly for investors, like who you recruit to your team, ultimately it will just make your business even better. There's no way it would, in my humble opinion, there's no way that it would be detrimental to not think about having diverse opinions and a diverse team.
And what do you say to people who say they're only interested in hiring the best, or they only see the color green or stuff like that? I mean, do you think thinking about diversity could take away from hiring the best or doing your best?
I think it's probably how you think about it. So I think there's certainly like well, you know, of course we care about it, but we're in a crunch. We just got to hire people. Yeah. So I definitely see that. Or my network itself is people like me. So I think it's not so much to be kind of accusing or like saying you're not doing your job, but it's definitely just make sure that it's part of your process in some way. You know, try to build up a more diverse network. And in this diversity, everyone has different opinions, whether it's gender or even geography, nationality. For 500, nationality and languages are a big part of how we define diversity, as well as gender and age. So I think just think about it from the perspective of how can it help your business versus that you're that it's a chore. So it's always going to be a bit of a balance, I think.
Yeah, I mean, as a 500 family member, I've been lucky enough to see what 500 does around the world, and I'm so glad that the audience here and people watching at home streaming also got to hear about 500 and what 500 does around the world and why it's so important, especially for places like Turkey or emerging markets. Thank you, Christine, for coming out and sharing your story with us. And Thank you guys for listening in.
Yeah, thank you.